Hey, welcome back everybody. We're here with Jakub from MSCI and we're talking about sustainable finance. Now, you did a great job of kind of describing a bit of the difference between like the corporate finance side of things and the corporate operations and kind of differentiating that from the investment side of things. I want to stay on the investor side of things for a moment and really ask what are some of the characteristics of a green investment or sustainable investment that an investor may look at? Or more specifically, like ESG factors that are really considered in sustainable investments. Like, what does that even mean?
Okay, so we have to go back to what I mentioned about the relevance of different themes, factors on different companies, depending again on their business model, the industry in which they are in. But broadly speaking, not surprisingly, we can classify them into three categories: environmental, social, and governance. And within those, we look at different factors or risks, which we call key issues, right? So maybe let's go one by one. What would we look, when it comes to the environmental pillar? So in the environmental pillar of our ratings, we would look at four themes on which we would assess companies. So the first one is things related to climate and climate change. So of course things like carbon emissions, how carbon intensive companies' operations are. Of course who is the bigger polluter, and so on. Also, of course, what is the carbon footprint of different products that companies are selling to their customers, and so on. The second large area is what I also mentioned before, the use of natural capital, because this is of course a key thing for many industries. Of course, talking about industries such as materials or even food and beverage. We mentioned the use of water, right? So they are really dependent on the use of natural capital. Again, managing these risks can be quite decisive, for their performance, right? Because let's say if they run into problems in sourcing some of the natural capital that they need in their operations, of course, it can either disrupt their entire production, or they may end up paying higher prices for these materials and so on. The third theme that we are looking at within our environmental pillar assessment would be pollution and waste, right? Of course, I think everyone can imagine why that's an important topic, both for companies, but also for the environment and the society, right? So we don't want our environment to be polluted, right? We want our waters to be clean, our air to be clean, and so on. So again, we would look at how companies are exposed to these risks, so which are polluting the most, and also how are they trying to address this, right? So perhaps, decrease the production of different, toxic emissions or different pollutions that they emit out there into the environment. And finally, we are not only trying to assess companies on the risk management, but also perhaps how they can act on or benefit from different environmental opportunities, right? So we mentioned that before. It can be things like, investments in renewable energy, right? It can be, anything that can perhaps not, I would say, mitigate the risks, but rather, let's say, increase their revenues, right? So all of these new technologies that are, let's say, in high demand, right? Also, we see these, not just with companies, but also households, right? In many countries, the preference is increasing, for being almost self-sufficient when it comes to energy generation, right? Through solar panels, through all of these ways. So, of course, companies that are involved in this line of business can benefit from that, right? So we want to, again, look at both the risk, but also opportunities, whether it's on the environmental side, but also on the social side. So maybe let's move into the social pillar. Similarly to the environmental pillar, we also look at a couple of themes within the social pillar. So I would maybe begin, first of all, what we are trying to assess is how the company is managing the risks that are perhaps coming from the inside, meaning its workforce, right? Yeah. So things like labor management, also human capital development, right? So how it's really maybe nurturing its workforce to make sure, that very simply speaking, people are happy and they are more productive and they deliver in their jobs, right? So this is that, I would say, inward-looking social assessment. So again, anything related to the company's workforce. The second large area is, of course, that kind of outward-looking one, so the relationship with the customers, right? What are companies selling to their customers, or in general how they are, managing the relationship between them and their customers. So, to imagine what would be included here is things like the safety of the products that the companies are selling to their customers, right? So of course it's again easy to imagine with maybe things such as food and beverage, right? Of course that they need to be safe to consume. But also, of course, medications. But it, of course, can be also, different physical goods that still need to be safe, to operate. The other maybe important topic, which would be also here, that kind of relationship with the customer. So it's not only what companies are selling to them, but also, for example, how they are handling their data that the customers are giving the companies, right? So of course, this is a major topic with let's say financial institutions such as banks, right? Like they have all of our sensitive information, whether it's personal information or financial information.
Right.
And of course, they need to protect this data, right? So you wouldn't want to see any data leaks, ideally, right? And so on. So they would expect these companies who do collect sensitive data. Of course, it's not just financial; it's any company that would do that. So you would expect them to apply, due care when they are handling your private data. And of course, again, so I mentioned a couple of risks, whether it's with the workforce, whether it's more towards customers, but also there are some opportunities, again, that companies can benefit from on the social side. So it's, again, things like maybe providing access to finance, providing access to healthcare, any of these things. So both, of course, this benefits the society, right? You give people means to have a bank account or, accessing healthcare or different services, but it can also, of course, help the companies, right? They can increase their customer base, right? Oftentimes it helps reputation, right? You are showing that you are trying to, address these, let's say, underserved segments of populations with your services and so on.
And I think this is where like diversity, equity, inclusion from a leadership perspective would also fit into that category as well.
Yeah, you could say so, although, again, are we talking about kind of these financial material ways or not? Not saying that diversity and inclusion is not, but again, depends, what we are trying to measure, right?
Right, and it depends on the level.
Yeah.
So maybe like the Hong Kong Exchange may require a certain level of diversity in terms of gender on a board or something, but yeah, it's calculated differently.
No, exactly, and that can be, and that's why I'm saying, not sure I put it here, or we would put it maybe in the governance, because oftentimes we are talking about, let's say diversity when it really comes to leadership positions, right? So not only have diverse workforce, but really the leadership at the company, because we know, in different markets there are these glass ceilings, right? So whether it's women or it can be ethnic minorities, we don't really see them, maybe in the very high up positions. So you can also, talk about these things in the governance or in the boardroom, let's say. And there again, I would maybe mention that we have a couple of research pieces that look into this, also the relationship between maybe having more diverse boards and again the company's performance, right? So do we see any connections there or not?
Great.
So,
and the third category from a governance perspective, other than what you just mentioned, was there anything else you wanted to mention?
Yes. So in the governance pillar, at least how we would look at it, I would maybe divide it into two groups. So one is the corporate governance, or more about the structures at the company to ensure, again, that there is appropriate supervision at the company. All the processes are working right. They are also set to prevent conflicts of interest, right, and so on. So there we would look at things like, as I already mentioned, the board composition, right? So the board is there to supervise the management, right, and act, in the interest of shareholders or even other stakeholders of the company, right? So of course you would, for example, like the board of the company to be independent from its management, right? Because if it's not, of course there is, if nothing else, at least a conflict of interest, right? So yeah, looking at the composition of the board, but not just the independence, but also things like the expertise on the board, right? So if we have risk managers on the board, if we have people who understand the industry, if we have financial expert on the board, right? So all of these skill sets that we would like to see there. Now probably even we need AI experts on the boards, right?
Sure.
And so on. So
Yeah.
it's very important how the boardroom is, how it looks like, or who it is composed of. Still, sticking with the structures, as I said, within the governance pillar, we of course also look at things like the ownership structure of the company, right? You want to understand who owns the company, which also means, who calls the shots there, right? Who makes the decisions, right? Because if you have a majority owner who usually has the most voting power too, they would of course pursue their interests, which may not always be aligned with your interests as either a minority shareholder or even a bondholder or other stakeholder in the company, right? So you at least want to understand how the ownership looks like. And then we also have assessments of course, the compensation structure. I would maybe say that's again something maybe easy to picture from the periods before the financial crisis. There were countless, research papers and articles about perhaps, these misaligned incentives, oftentimes in the financial companies where maybe some, short-term risk-taking was awarded, right? So we want to prevent this, right? We would ideally like the pay structure at the company to reward, sustainability, but sustainability now meaning, long-term performance of the company, right? So that can include different provisions such as, clawbacks, the part of the compensation has to be returned, if some issues arise later. Of course, vesting of different benefits, into the future, so not everything is paid out immediately and so on, right? So again, just pay structure that encourages kind of long-term sustainable thinking, you could say. So that's on that structural side, and I would say then also within the governance pillar, we would look at the behavior at the company. And there we again go to things that I mentioned, such as, anti-competitive practices, different involvement in perhaps, bribery, corruption, and all of these kind of corporate behavior incidents that we probably any of us has read about in the past.
Yeah, and we're seeing, plenty of the examples of that today. Yeah, okay, that makes sense.